What's up, Investomaniacs? Your boy Nat Ratter here, and today we're going to be talking about how many stocks you should own in your stock portfolio. So, first of all, what's the general range of recommendations? Almost all recommendations are going to be somewhere between 5 and 50 stocks. Now, I know that's like, well, you're like, well, thanks, that's a pretty large recommendation, but yes, it is first important to let's just observe a general range. Don't own below 5 and don't own more than 50. Most people can agree on that, so let's use that as a base. And plus, you can also throw in the S&P 500 ETF, which most people say you can pretty much own as much of that as you want to. So what is the general goal of investing for a beginner? Now, if you ask most people, they're like, oh, I know the answer to this question. It's to make a whole lot of money. Wrong. The goal for a beginner investor, and some would argue the goal for any investor, is to not lose money. It's to cap your downside. The general concept is if you cap the downside, the upside will take care of itself. Now, I'd say this is more important and more true for beginners because you don't know what you're doing, so you really have to do anything that you can to protect yourself from your own ignorance. That is what Mr. Warren Buffett says, after all. As a beginner, diversification is used to protect yourself from ignorance. As a professional, you don't really need diversification so much because you know what you're doing, but as a beginner, you got to diversify. So my advice is 20 to 50 stocks. This is for beginners with a maximum initial allocation of 5% in a given stock. This is to your preference. For example, you can have 20 stocks at 5% each, 50 stocks at 2% each. You could have 25 stocks at 4%, 30 stocks at 3.3%, or 50 stocks at 10 of the stocks are at 5%. That's 50% total. 5 stocks at 3%. That's 15% for 65% total. And the remaining 35 stocks at 1% each for 100%, right? However you want to do it, as long as you don't exceed 5% in a given security. You may also own the S&P 500. I recommend the SPY, and or NASDAQ 100. I recommend the QQQ. This is to your preferences, meaning it can be anywhere between 0 and 100% of your portfolio. Now, there is an exception to this 20 stock minimum rule, and that is this. If you own the S&P 500 and or NASDAQ 100, you may reduce individual stock holdings as desired so long as no individual stock's initial allocation exceeds 5% of total portfolio. So, examples of the maximum recommended thresholds. If none of your portfolio is in the SPY or QQQ, then you want to have 20 stocks at 5% each, right? That's the maximum threshold. If 10% of your portfolio is in the S&P 500 or NASDAQ 100, then you would only have to have 18 stocks at 5% each. That would be the maximum threshold because you do have that 10% in the ETFs, so you don't actually have to have 20 because, again, it's this 5% maximum threshold. That's what we're really looking at, is the 5% maximum threshold. If you had 50% of your portfolio in the S&P 500 or NASDAQ 100, you'd only have to have 10 stocks at 5% each. 90% in the S&P 500 or QQQ, then you only have to own 2 stocks at 5%. But again, you could have 10 stocks at 1% each. This is just the maximum threshold. And naturally, you could just have all your money in the S&P 500 and not own any individual stocks. Now, once you feel capable, you then have the option to gradually increase the risk of your securities and or decrease the number of holdings and or increase the maximum allocation to any given stock. This is just for beginners, what we're talking about right now. So let's talk about some of the advantages of owning 20 plus stocks. It's very low risk compared to only owning 5 to 10. Now, some people would say, I'm giving you the kind of counter argument. They'll say it's more risky to own 20 plus compared to 510 because normal kind of retail investors don't have the time to do full research on 20 plus stocks, whereas they can do the research on 5 to 10. So the argument is it's less risky to hold fewer stocks because you can actually do the research and therefore you can make better decisions. Now, the reasoning is somewhat sound. The problem is it's just wrong because beginners don't really know how to make proper decisions. I mean, I'm sure there's going to be a couple like I don't know, like unicorns out there who can make great decisions on day one, but the vast majority of people cannot make good decisions, including myself, when we first start. We have to kind of screw up a little bit. We have to do a couple things wrong, and that's why it's so important to diversify. And so we don't, those little mistakes are little, and they're not massive mistakes that are 20% of our portfolio. So I believe the benefit of diversification outweighs the genuine negative that you will not know as much about every single one of your holdings. Another advantage, it requires close to zero maintenance once set up. So if you so desire, you can just walk away for several months and you're fine. If it's like, oh, you know what, I'm gonna go take a vacation. I want to spend more time with my kid. I got a second job, like whatever. I want to focus more on my business. You don't actually have to pay so much attention. In contrast, if you do only have like 5 stocks, you really have to pay attention to those stocks because they're such a massive percentage of your portfolio. And this is really counterproductive, particularly if you have a small portfolio. So if you only have like couple $1,000 invested, like why are you wasting your time spending so much time researching these 5 companies when at the end of the day, like pragmatically, you only have like $10,000 invested? It's like, who cares? Like focus your time on making more money in terms of earned income, building a business, getting a second job, something like that, putting more money in your stock portfolio. And then once you have a larger stock portfolio, you can then worry more about actively managing that portfolio. Now it's important, obviously we want to learn. So even when I had a small portfolio, I would still spend some time because I wanted to learn about the stock market. I was interested by the stock market. But I always came at it from the angle, I'm doing this from a learning standpoint. I understand. I never want to spend too much time doing this kind in reality, my time is better spent, building my business and earning more income so that I then have more money to invest. But I kind of want to know what I'm doing a little bit once I actually get that money. So we do want to put time into the stock market for learning processes. If this is assuming we don't have a whole lot of money, we still want to learn because someday we want to have more money, right? But we don't want to spend too much time. We want to spend the large majority of our time increasing our earned income. Another advantage, it still allows for practice in stock picking. So whether you buy 5 stocks or 20 stocks or 30 stocks or 40 stocks, you still need to go through the same basic process. And the truth is most beginner investors have a relatively simplistic kind of understanding of how to invest in stocks. They're like, okay, so there's the PE, right? That's the price to the earnings. So I take the price, I divide it by the earnings, and then if it's if it's a low number, I buy it, right? And then if it's a high number, I sell it, right? Like that's obviously I'm kind of making a joke here, but that's like the level of understanding, which is, that's totally normal. You're not educated yet. You're a beginner. You don't really know what you're doing. So you're learning where everybody else starts learning, which is kind of like the PE ratio. That's where everybody starts learning. And you're like, all right, this is what I know. Of course, once you're an advanced investor, you're like, the PE ratio is like such a simplistic, just one of many, many things you're looking at. It doesn't necessarily mean anything in it of itself. I think 4 of the 6 stocks I own are losing money, which means they have no PE ratio, right? So once you kind of know what you're doing, it doesn't mean a whole lot. And therefore, because you have so few metrics you're going off of, because your understanding of stocks is so kind of elementary at this standpoint, it doesn't take a whole lot of time to go through that kind of process of deciding what you want to invest in. So whether you're investing in 5 stocks or 50 stocks, as a beginner, you can go through that process relatively quickly. Of course, it's a little bit different once you learn a little bit more. And also the last advantage is, I would say, that it's very forgiving for mistakes, which you will inevitably make as a beginner. What are the disadvantages? So it does not allow for the same possibility of growth compared to 5 to 10 stocks. If you know what you're doing, if you are a very good investor, you do want to be, some would argue against this. Some very high, smart people would still say you want to own 20 plus stocks, right? But there are also a lot of very smart people who would say you can get very concentrated once you know what you're doing and you're very good. So that's still kind of split. But of those who say you want to get more concentrated, it's because you know what you're doing, so you can increase the probability of making more money because you can be more concentrated in stocks that have the highest percentage of returning you the most amount of money. But as a beginner, we really don't know what that is yet. So it's kind of it's a little bit of like an oxymoron to say it's a disadvantage, because the truth is you're not educated enough to pick the good stocks yet. So it's not really a real disadvantage. It's only a disadvantage once you kind of know what you're doing. At that point, you then need to weigh kind of diversification against maximum potential growth. But for beginners, I don't think it's a genuine disadvantage. But that is something that you're going to hear nonetheless. The other disadvantage and this one is somewhat true, is it can discourage you from paying attention to an individual stock because it represents such a low percentage of your portfolio. So on the high end, if you own 50 stocks and an individual stock is 2% of your portfolio, you're like, oh, that doesn't matter. And then what ends up is you kind of end up just saying, well, none of these matter. They're basically all pointless because they all represent such small portions of my portfolio. And then sometimes that will lead to you just doing nothing and not listening to any conference calls or reading any 10Qs or 10Ks. And so that can be a bad thing. But again, we have to weigh that against the benefit of being diversified, and I do think that's good. And the truth is, if you're only doing the research because 20% of your money is in there, you're probably not the type of person who should be that heavily concentrated anyway, because people who are invested and become very good investors, they just like love the art of investing. They like to listen to conference calls, and they like to read 10Qs and read 10Ks, and they like to do their evaluation process. So this is something where I would say, take it from this standpoint. You're doing it as a learning process. The truth is, no, you're not going to be able to keep up on 30, 40, 50 stocks, especially not to the same degree that you could keep up on 5 stocks. But you can still pick and you can listen to 1 quarter a year, right? Instead of listening to every quarter, listen to 1 quarter a year, or just read the 10K, or which is the annual report. And just check up on the news every now and then. You don't have to necessarily do it as concentrated as you would if you only had 5 stocks, and you don't even have to do it with all 50 stocks. That's fine if you say, you know what, I want to own 50 for diversification, but I'm actually going to focus on these 10 just for practice that I'm going to actually actively keep up on. That's okay as a beginner. Whatever you're doing more for practice and learning purposes than anything else. But there is still that potential idea where like, oh, people just wave it off. Like, I'm just not going to do anything, which is kind of part of also the advantage, which requires close to zero maintenance. So it's kind of a good and a bad thing. So what should you do now? It's your decision. And a couple things I would take into consideration in your decision is your risk tolerance. What is your risk tolerance? The lower you feel your risk tolerance is, the more stocks you should hold, because that's more diversified and less risky. The more risky you feel, the higher your risk tolerance is, then I would get closer and closer to that 20 position number. How confident are you in your ability to do it? There are some beginners out there who I'm sure can make fantastic decisions their very first time around. I'm sure they exist. I wasn't one of them, but I'm sure they exist. So that ultimately is a judgment call on your personal level. And again, the more confident you are, the lesser number of stocks you would hold. The less confident you are, the higher number of stocks you would hold. How much time you want to dedicate. This can be kind of a bit counterintuitive, but I'd say the more time you would want to dedicate, you would actually kind of go towards the 20, and the less time you want to dedicate, you'd maybe actually go towards the 50, because again, that comes down to the less time you want to dedicate, that's effectively being more passive, and therefore you want to be more diversified, and so that you would actually want to go to a larger number the less time you want to spend on it. But I would take some of those things into consideration and what your decision is, how many positions you want to be in. But I would also say, remember, you are a beginner, and assume you will make mistakes. And if you remember that and keep that in your decision-making process, and you make the decision on how many positions you want to have and how you want to allocate your portfolio with remembering, I am a beginner, I am going to make mistakes, and I'm going to make investing decisions going into it, assuming I'm going to make mistakes, and that way you'll lean a little bit on the conservative side, and that should help you overall as a beginner, because you probably will make mistakes, as I made mistakes. So that's my advice. Hope you guys have a great day. Hit subscribe if you haven't subscribed. If you want to click the notification thing, apparently I'm supposed to say to do that. Hope you guys have a good one, Investomaniacs.